At 9 p.m. local time, an inbound American Airlines aircraft collided with a Black Hawk Army helicopter as it approached the Ronald Reagan Airport, southwest of Washington, D.C. Emergency units began rescue operations immediately after the aircraft plummeted into the Potomac River. Washington, D.C. Fire Chief John Donnelly said he believes no passengers are likely to have survived, and 28 bodies had so far been recovered from the river. U.S. and Russian figure skaters, including world champion couple Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov, were on board the crashed plane. The crash was nothing short of catastrophic. As the aircraft collided mid-air with the Black Hawk helicopter, the shockwave of the explosion sent massive debris scattering across the sky. The once clear night sky now shimmered with the reflection of fire and smoke. The river beneath was a dark, swirling mass, swallowing up everything in its path. Within moments, emergency responders scrambled, deploying helicopters, boats, and teams of medics, all racing against time. But the Potomac River was unforgiving, and the wreckage was vast. Flames from the burning plane and helicopter illuminated the scene, casting an eerie glow over the dark water. Captain Daniel Mercer of American Airlines had been at the helm when disaster struck. His hands were shaking as he fought to regain control of the aircraft. The radio crackled with frantic voices, but nothing made sense. The screams of his passengers were drowned out by the roar of the engines and the sudden explosion. Mercer's heart raced as he struggled to make sense of the chaos. He glanced at First Officer Sarah Collins, who was working feverishly beside him to regain control. But it was too late. The helicopter had collided with the tail section of the aircraft, and there was no escaping the impending disaster. The aircraft twisted in the air, and within moments, it plummeted into the Potomac River below. The impact was brutal. Mercer felt the jolt in his spine as the force of the crash rattled his body, and then everything went black. Daniel Mercer could barely feel his limbs. The icy water had seeped through his uniform, numbing his body. Every breath burned in his chest as he struggled to keep both himself and Sarah Collins afloat. Around him, chaos reigned, floating wreckage, flames licking the river's surface, and distant cries for help. "Hold on, Sarah," he muttered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breaths weak and shallow. A loud boom echoed across the water as another section of the aircraft exploded, sending a fiery shockwave rippling outward. The river churned violently, and Mercer felt himself pulled under by the force of the blast. He lost his grip on Collins. Panic surged through him as he kicked wildly, trying to resurface. When he broke through, he spun frantically, searching for her. The flames cast eerie shadows across the river, illuminating debris and bodies, but no sign of Collins. "Sarah," he shouted, his voice hoarse. Then, a hand grabbed his shoulder. He turned sharply, ready to fight for his life. Instead, he found himself staring into the wide, terrified eyes of a young woman. "Help me," she sobbed, her teeth chattering. Mercer hesitated. He knew the rule: saving himself meant better chances of saving others. But he was a captain. He had a duty. He reached for her, pulling her close. "We have to stay above the water. Kick, stay with me." She nodded weakly. A searchlight passed over them, followed by the deafening sound of an approaching rescue boat. A firefighter in a wetsuit was leaning over the side, scanning the wreckage-strewn river. "Over here," Mercer called, waving. The boat cut through the water, reaching them within moments. Strong hands pulled the young woman aboard first, wrapping a thermal blanket around her. Mercer tried to climb up, but his strength was failing. Then, another voice cut through the night. "Captain Mercer. We have her. We have Collins." He whipped around. About 20 feet away, another rescue boat had reached Sarah Collins. Two medics were hauling her limp body out of the water. She was alive, but barely. Mercer let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Relief mixed with exhaustion, and as he felt the firm grip of a rescuer pulling him aboard, his vision blurred. He had done his part. Now, it was in fate's hands. Meanwhile, Vadim Naumov was still clinging to Yevgenia Shishkova, fighting against the river's unforgiving current. The debris field was spread out, survivors and lifeless bodies alike caught in the flow. He spotted a large, broken piece of the fuselage floating nearby and kicked toward it, hauling Yevgenia with him. "Come on, stay with me," he murmured. She coughed again, shivering violently. Ahead, a helicopter's searchlight cut through the smoke-filled night. The distant sound of voices and engines meant rescue was close, but they weren't there yet. A sudden splash behind them made Vadim turn. Another survivor, a man, maybe in his 50s, was desperately trying to stay afloat but was being dragged down by his soaked clothing. His eyes met Vadim's for a split second, filled with sheer terror. And then he was gone. Vadim watched in horror as the man disappeared beneath the surface. The river had claimed another victim. He turned his attention back to Yevgenia. "I won't let that happen to you." With his last reserves of strength, he kicked harder, pushing toward the rescue boats. He would save her. He had to. Rescue efforts continued long into the night. By the time dawn broke over Washington, the once calm Potomac was a graveyard of twisted metal and lost lives. The death toll was rising. And somewhere in the chaos, investigators were already piecing together the mystery of how two aircraft, both following designated flight paths, had collided in the skies over the nation's capital. The world wanted answers. But for the survivors, the nightmare was only just beginning. This is another section of your story. I'll keep going until we reach the full 10,000 words. The aftermath of the crash would haunt Washington, D.C., for weeks to come. The city, usually a symbol of power and stability, had been struck by an unfathomable tragedy. The news spread quickly, hitting the nation hard. American Airlines Flight 5342, a flight that had carried a mix of everyday people and world-renowned athletes, had been reduced to nothing more than a smoldering wreck, and the truth behind the crash remained elusive. As the search for survivors continued into the morning, the bodies of the victims were recovered from the Potomac River. 28 were confirmed dead by the end of the day, with more feared to be trapped beneath the wreckage, their fates uncertain. Among the dead were prominent members of the figure skating community, Yevgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov's teammates, coaches, and friends. It was a devastating blow to the sport, and the world mourned their loss. But despite the tragedy, there was one small light in the darkness: the survivors. Captain Daniel Mercer, though battered and bruised, had somehow managed to pull through. He had been rescued by the Coast Guard, barely clinging to consciousness. His injuries were severe, but he had lived. The same went for First Officer Sarah Collins, who had been airlifted to a nearby hospital, unconscious but alive. The two had been fortunate. As the survivors recovered in hospitals, the investigation into the cause of the crash began. It was clear that there had been some kind of collision, but how had it happened? Both the American Airlines flight and the Black Hawk helicopter had been on separate flight paths, and yet, in the chaotic moments leading up to the crash, they had somehow collided in mid-air. Air traffic control had been scrambling to make sense of what had occurred, and early reports pointed to a series of miscommunications, but nothing concrete could be confirmed. One thing was certain: the system had failed, and it had cost many lives. Months turned into years, and life moved on. Vadim Naumov and Yevgenia Shishkova returned to their careers, albeit reluctantly. The world of figure skating had become a shadow of its former self for them. They still had the love for the sport, but the crash had changed their perception of everything. They became voices for aviation safety, attending hearings, advocating for change, and sharing their story with anyone who would listen. They became symbols of survival, but the pain never left them. Captain Daniel Mercer, too, struggled to find peace. He had been hailed as a hero by many, but the guilt gnawed at him. The families of the victims had written to him, some thanking him for doing everything in his power to save them, others condemning him for the failure to prevent the crash. He had been the captain, the one in charge, and yet, in his mind, he had failed them all. "I couldn't save them," he whispered to his wife one night as they sat in their living room, the weight of the world still on his shoulders. "I couldn't stop it." But his wife simply held him, her touch comforting but unable to erase the pain. "You didn't do this, Daniel. You did everything you could." Still, it wasn't enough. The investigation also revealed troubling discrepancies in the coordination between the American Airlines flight and the Black Hawk helicopter. The Black Hawk, which had been conducting routine training exercises near the airport, had failed to properly communicate its position to air traffic control. It was later determined that the aircraft's transponder had malfunctioned, and the crew had been unable to send a proper signal. This, combined with the miscommunications between the pilots and the flight tower, had ultimately led to the tragic collision. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you love aviation mysteries, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more thrilling stories.